A centuries-long dispute over oil-rich lands in South America continues to rage between Venezuela and Guyana, with the hand of the United States visible behind the scenes. This weekend, Venezuela will conduct a referendum to ask its people how the government should proceed. For more on that, we spoke with journalists Stephen Sefton from Nicaragua and Camila Escalante from Toronto, Canada, via Skype on Wednesday. Stephen, first tell us, what exactly is this referendum about, and then we can discuss what it means in the larger picture.
Yeah, sure, Don. And there is this referendum being held in Venezuela on December the 3rd. And it's a referendum asking the people of Venezuela what they think the country's position should be in relation to Venezuela's claim over the disputed territory of the Essequibo, an area of about 160,000 square kilometers around or to the west of the Essequibo River. And it's a territory between Venezuela and Guyana. And ever since the 19th century, there's been a dispute between the power that was controlling Guyana at any given time. For most of the time, it was the British colonial power, and the respective governments of Venezuela throughout the whole period since 1840. Because in 1840, the British contracted a Prussian explorer to map out the Essequibo area that Britain was claiming, because there was no established map, agreed map at the time. And he mapped out a huge area that marked off a big chunk of Venezuela as well. And so, of course, the Venezuelans objected to that. There was a proposal for an arbitration that was agreed in 1897, but the curious thing about that arbitration was that Venezuela didn't take part directly. It was represented by the United States against the British colonial power. And so in the decision of that arbitration, which is called the Laudo of Paris, the Paris arbitration decision, Britain and the United States reached a political agreement on the basis of which Britain got a huge chunk of the territory that should legitimately have been assigned to Venezuela. So then Venezuela obviously immediately rejected that, and right all through the last century, up until about 1962 or so, they were negotiating with Britain, and finally they agreed with Britain an agreement called the Geneva Agreement in this context, which was signed in 1966. But Guyana, now under the influence of the big oil companies, especially ExxonMobil, is claiming a much bigger chunk of the territory, and obviously the maritime drilling rights and the land drilling rights to the hydrocarbons in the Essequibo area, which are supposed to amount to a huge reserve of gas and oil. So Guyana has tried to take the case to the International Court of Justice in The Hague, which has accepted it has jurisdiction. Venezuela rejects that jurisdiction and insists on the implementation of the 1966 agreement. And whereas Guyana bases its claim on the disputed 1899 judgment, Venezuela rejects that because it breaches various features of the 1969 Vienna Treaty on Conventions, which provides for the nullification of historical conventions and treaties on the basis of various reasons. So that's where the situation has reached at the moment. And what the Venezuela is seeking to do is to demonstrate that it has a categorical popular mandate for the position that the government is taking. And that's the object of the referendum on December the 3rd. And they're basically asking the people of Venezuela 5 questions, and they virtually all have to do with whether the Venezuelan population accepts that Venezuela has the right to the territory in question, whether the process of negotiation with Guyana should be based on the 1966 agreement or not, and various other related matters. So it's very important in the national context in Venezuela because it's an example of something that completely transcends political and ideological differences.
Right.
And so, and that's in the context of the current insistence by Venezuela that the United States lifts its sanctions at a time when the United States is trying to get access to Venezuela's oil resources again. And so it's trying to relax some sanctions, but not the way Venezuela wants. The European Union is also reviewing its coercive measures that it's taken against Venezuela. So that's part of the context of this, in which the referendum is being held. And also, there's also the issue of the process, agreeing a process for the presidential elections of next year. And so the referendum is important, not just in the sense, the narrow legal sense about Venezuela's claim on the disputed territory, but in the political context and the economic context of the country. It's also important in terms of demonstrating that the government has categorical support for overall, for its general position in relation to the elections, and as well as economic policy. And it's worth pointing out that over the last couple of days, President Maduro has pointed out that Venezuela has had 2 years, slightly over 2 years, of consistent and constant economic growth, which, based on the figures he was using, amounts to something like 5% a year. But I think maybe Camilla can fill in with more detail on the political context, especially with regard to the elections and relations with the United States.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, in recent days, weeks, months, Venezuela has reached some agreements with international companies since Venezuela has spoken to Washington. They've held extensive talks with Washington. They've also had mediation with sectors of the opposition, I think mediated by Barbados, and they agreed to ease some of the oil sector related sanctions, which in principle, like you said, will allow Venezuela to continue to recover its oil sector production and all that it provides for the economy. And like you said, an election will be taking place next year, about 12 months from now, to elect a new president. And so we don't know what all of the terms and the fine details are in these deals. But we do know that the United States, although it seems as if the United States is making concessions. That's kind of how it's being framed, that the Venezuelan government is making concessions with regards to how the election will be held, going along the lines, obviously, of free, transparent elections. That's what the United States is demanding once again. But the U.S. is trying to use its usual template, saying that they will require, this foreign government is going to require that Venezuela let in those foreign observers, which specifically they want to see the OAS and the EU in Venezuela observing their elections. They always insist that those must oversee our sovereign processes. And at the same time, they insist that their candidate, the preferred candidate of the Yankees, be able to run in Venezuela. And right now, the supposed frontrunner is a far-right figure named Maria Corina Machado. And this is amid, obviously, a far-right emergence in our region in general. But this is someone who's a media personality, who's very wealthy, who has for so many years lived in Miami outside of her own country. And she's basically being, sprinkled into or parachuted back into Caracas to be able to run against the Bolivarian Revolution. And until today, like for years and years, the Secretary General of the OAS, Luis Almagro, has been on a monthly basis producing these lists of supposed documented political prisoners in Venezuela. So they are continuing to pressure Venezuela with all of these threats, with all of this sort of blackmail, while having these so-called concessions to allow them to, recover their economy. But I think that it's all coming, what's actually happening is that they're pressuring them from Guyana. They're pressuring them with that encroachment on, that disputed territory. And they're also pressuring them politically and in all sorts of other ways, which makes things very difficult going forward to this electoral process, which will be carried out in the following year.
Yeah. So, we've seen this kind of action pretty much across the region. Most recently, the Argentinian election, which is kind of interesting, given you would think that there would be a unity of interest between Argentina and Venezuela on this question, because it's in essence the same as the Maldives question against Britain. It's also a Dutch and a British claim in the case of Guyana, but British claim against the sovereign rights of Venezuela in one case, and a British claim against the sovereign rights of Argentina in the other. And they should be working together, and at the moment they're not, because of the United States. Thank you guys for your time this week. We are out of time, and we'll look forward to speaking with you again next week.
Thank you. Have a good one, Don.
Thank you very much, Don. Let's talk next week.
Thank you, too. All right. Take care, guys. For KPFK, I'm Don DeBar.